Namaste. Hope you are making good use of your isolation during this COVID time. In this video, I want to discuss a serious issue, but through the medium of cinema. Watch till the end, and I promise you it's going to be totally worth your socially isolated time. I'm sure you've heard of this before. Some of the finest movies, actors, and technicians in Indian cinema ever have come out of Kerala. When it comes to quality, Malayalam movies are probably the best in the country. There is no doubt that Kerala is also one of the most politically aware states in India. And this is reflected in the movies that are made in the state. Particularly during the 1980s and 90s, these political movies were quite popular. Even now, such movies are made, though not as many. Preponderance of the leftist ideology among the faculty at film institutes and generally among the exponents of creative arts means that most political movies, not just in Kerala, espouse the cause of Marxism and communism. I call these movies the red films. I've talked in more detail about the subject of red films in my vlog about communism. If you haven't watched that video yet, please do so now. You will find a link to that video here. But because politics is such an integral part of people's lives in Kerala, the ideological stringency of red films made in Malayalam is that much more fanatical. So much so that there have been movies starring legends of Malayalam cinema that justify violence as a legitimate political tool to defeat the class enemies of communism. In addition to being propaganda vehicles for communism and generally the broader leftist ideology, the red films feature some other constant elements. A pronounced disdain for women and their role in the society, particularly in politics, is one of them. To demonstrate my thesis, I will discuss two movies that were separated by almost 3 decades but have identical central elements. Buckle up for an interesting ride. We'll discuss the unrelenting misogyny of Kerala's red films in this video. I'm Madhavan and this is The Basement. So, the two movies I want to talk to you about today are Lal Salam, released in 1990, and Sakhava, released in 2017. First off, Lal Salam. The title doesn't need translation. It has been the preferred greeting of every bloodthirsty communist in this country. The movie itself is a bona fide classic in every sense. It has Mohanlal in one of his most memorable performances. Others in the cast include Murli, Geeta, Urvashi and Jagadi, who are all brilliant in their respective roles. The basic premise of the movie is a clash between two communists. This is shown through the evolution of the 3 main characters in the story. Nettur Stephen, played by Mohanlal, D.K. Anthony, played by Murali, and Sethu Lakshmi, played by Geeta. I'll briefly narrate the story and then get into how the female characters are treated in the story. The story is set during the early days of independence, spanning a few years on either side of the formation of the first communist government in Kerala. The 3 main protagonists are prominent leaders of Communist Party in Alleppey. As an aside, it is said that these 3 characters are based on real-life CPI leaders, Varghese Vaidyan, T.P. Thomas and K.R. Gauriamma. The comrades attempt to disrupt the economic activity in the region by instigating farm labourers to go on a strike. And when the landlord brings in labourers from outside to get the job done, the communists start a riot and murder the landlord. Did you notice something? Right from the days of Marx through Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot and the present day Azadi chanting comrades in JNU, communists have adopted the same techniques to pursue their brand of politics. As recently as in January of this year, JNU comrades were going around beating up fellow students who were just trying to attend classes instead of participating in their pointless strike. Violence, it seems, is the only political tool that the commies possess. Anyway, coming back to our story, after murdering the landlord for the crime of nothing more than wanting to harvest his own field, the 3 comrades go underground to escape from the police. After a while, Sethu is captured and jailed. The 2 main comrades, however, evade the police for some more time, hiding in the house of a young woman and her bedridden father. Eventually, they too are jailed after being captured. When released from the jail, the upper caste Sethu and upper class Anthony are given election tickets by the Communist Party, while Stephen is left to fend for himself. Sethu and Anthony go on to become ministers and then get married also. Stephen, meanwhile, transforms into a rich contractor but is still a communist at heart. Like, really. Things heat up when Sethu discovers that her husband has been pursuing an extramarital affair with the woman in whose house he was hiding during his run from the police. The domestic squabble spills into the government and politics, and the two ministers separate. The conflict is resolved by Anthony dying in a road accident, and the movie ends. Now, let's look at how female characters are treated in the movie. At the end of the movie, Stephen pledges on Anthony's grave that he'll groom Anthony's son from the illicit relationship into a true communist, like Anthony and Stephen. For if they are the true communist, who then is the corrupted or fake communist in the story? As I said earlier, there are three primary characters in the movie around who the story revolves. The two male leads are the heroes, the kind of people a true communist should aspire to be. And throughout the movie, it is implied that Sethu, the upper caste Hindu woman, is the kind of communist because of who the movement has lost its way. She is portrayed as a shallow, gullible woman who is easily manipulated by vested interests. So, what is Sethu's corruption? Why is she a bad communist? How did she deviate from the true path shown by Marx? The movie doesn't tell us that Sethu takes bribes for herself or for the party. She doesn't fail in her duties as politician or as a minister. She doesn't start advocating for individual rights, or she doesn't oppose the use of violence as a political tool. So what exactly makes her a bad communist? Her supreme crime is that she objects to her husband's philandering ways, and when he does not agree to mend his ways, she walks out of the relationship. That is what makes a woman a bad communist according to the makers of this red film, who, by the way, were all card-carrying members of CPM in real life also. On the other hand, Anthony has no compunction making out with a young woman even while her dying father is bedridden in the next room. He ditches her to marry rich Sethu, and once done with Sethu, he goes back to continuing the secret extramarital affair with the same woman. After all this, he is made out to be some innocent victim of circumstances whose merrymaking ways is to be entertained by the wife because he is some true comrade. But the kind of attitude from the leftists does not surprise us anymore, isn't it? Even now, don't we see that whenever a terrorist is killed by the security forces, all we hear from the leftists is that he is a poor schoolmaster's son, or that he is an aspiring football player or a model. This is their constant attitude. As long as a person agrees with their poisonous ideology, they'll whitewash any and every crime. Anyway, let's not digress. So when Sethu comes to know about her husband sleeping around, she confronts him, and Anthony promptly brings out the victim card and flatly denies to mend his ways. When that does not work, he defaults to his violent ways. Finally, Anthony dies after an accident and Sethu repents and apologizes. But Anthony and Stephen do not regret any of their actions. Can a male comrade ever be wrong? Really? Another female character of some importance in Lal Salam is Stella, played by Rekha. She is the young woman who gives shelter to Anthony and Neturan when they are on the run from the police. During this hiding period, she gets into a physical relationship with Anthony, becomes pregnant with his son, and is abandoned when Anthony goes to jail. When Stella finds out about Anthony's release from the prison, she goes to meet him and is promptly paid off into silence. She later continues the relationship with a married Anthony, which leads to his split from Sethu and the climax. Stella's character is used as a contrast with Sethu. She is the example of the kind of good partner that female communists should aspire to be to their male comrades. The kind who offer their bodies to entertain their male comrades and tolerate every violation happily without demanding for rights or justice. But strong, self-made women like Sethu, who do not put up with the comrades who cannot keep up their pant zips shut, are the villains. My second example to show the misogyny in red films is the movie Sakhava. In Malayalam, Sakhava means comrade. So, from the name itself, the subject matter of the film should be clear. It has one of Malayalam cinema's current superstars, Nivin Poli, in a dual role, playing an old gen Sakhava and a new gen Sakhava. Compared to our first example, Lal Salam, this doesn't come anywhere close, either in the strength of the script or the acting. But this is the best that the current lot of commie propagandists have to offer. So we'll have to make do with it. There's not much story to summarize in this new age red film. Once again, the whole point of the movie is to define an ideal Sakhava. The new age Sakhava Poli is a bad, corrupted commie determined to climb up the political ladder and prepared to do anything to that end. By chance, he is introduced to the life of a good ideal commie, our old age Sakhava Poli, who is full of sanctimonious homilies about communism and what a good Sakhava should be, all delivered with a stiff, rigid, monotone expression. Incidentally, both the new age and old age Sakhavas have the same name, Krishnan, and a matching blood group too. Once current Sakhava Krishnan learns about former Sakhava Krishnan, he too instantaneously transforms into an ideal communist and promptly adopts his violent methods of extracting justice. This left me wondering were all the other comrades that he was interacting with all through his life so bad that they were not able to put him the right path? What does that say about the current mainstream communist movement that a retired comrade has to teach its new gen practitioners about idealism? Isn't it? Anyway, coming to the treatment of female characters in the movie, unlike Sedulakshmi of Lal Salam, there aren't any female characters in Sakhava that are significant to the story. The purpose of every female character is to serve as a prop to eulogize the greatness of our old ideal Sakhava. Aishwarya Rajesh plays Janaki, the ever obedient, submissive wife of Sakhava Krishnan. When her parents run into trouble finding a suitable groom for her because of her communist activism, our Sakhava Krishnan nonchalantly, even irritatedly, declares if nothing works out, he himself will marry her. Trivial things like seeking consent of the concerned woman clearly do not apply to our great Sakhava. The institution of marriage is a payment voucher to secure the participation of a female comrade in party work. Finally, after a year when someone reminds him of the promise to marry Janaki, he makes it clear that he intends to be neither a good father to their future kids or a good husband to her, but will go ahead to marry her only because with Janaki he will be free to pursue a full-time party career without any restrictions. Then he disappears on the day of the wedding to settle some labor dispute without so much as a word of intimation to Janaki, leaving her heartbroken. But when he leisurely comes back after a day, she is still there, waiting for him, and most obediently agrees to go ahead with the wedding while he drags her away by the wrist. Again, not a word of apology. Didn't I tell you? Communists idealize a certain type of women as good comrades. The type who are docile, obedient, and do not object to being treated as props to glorify the great male Sakhavas. It is said that all art is literally a mirror of the artist's mind. And if we think about it, the misogyny we see in the red films is a fair recreation of how the comrades act in real world. How many times have we heard the names of high-flying leftist activists, artists, journalists, and the so-called comedians come up during the Me Too saga? Haven't we heard of the exploits of a particular journalist, once the darling of the liberal crowd, involving female interns and lifts? The news reports are filled with stories of female Naxal cadres being sexually exploited by their male comrades. Even the university campuses with dominant left student unions are not devoid of this malaise. In the leftist worldview, women are merely objects to be used for the sexual pleasure of the male comrades. Their proclamations of support for feminism and women's empowerment are nothing but empty virtue signaling to hide this ugly, perverted underbelly. It is only the Indic way of life, which offers true respect and dignity to the women.
That's it for today's episode. Hope you like it. Share it with your family, friends, and WhatsApp groups. Before you leave, click the like button, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon to be notified about future updates. Till I see you again, Namaste.